This hearing this morning, I believe, has two basic goals. The first is to introduce to the stakeholder community the initial preprint bills that the legislature has developed to address the Delta crisis, and second, to hear the perspectives of a very broad set of experts and stakeholders, perspectives that I believe will help inform the process of revising and voting on these bills in the weeks ahead. I don't think I need to tell many of you in this room that we arrive at this hearing at a very auspicious moment for California water. We've got a dying Delta ecosystem, crashing fisheries, the third consecutive year of drought for most of the state, the second and very unprecedented second consecutive closure of the salmon fishery in California, and the Delta is at the center of a very real and severe water crisis. The Delta is also in very bad shape. Many of us were pleased last week when a top Obama administration official recognized the Delta as a resource of national and international importance, comparing it to the Everglades, the Great Lakes, and Chesapeake Bay. But this is also the year that the Delta earned a very dubious recognition. It was ranked the top most endangered river by the conservation group American Rivers. And scientists largely agree that there are three primary contributing factors to the demise of the Delta: excessive water diversions, polluted runoff, and invasive species. But I would argue that there's a fourth culprit in the demise of the Delta, and that is the lack of accountable, transparent, and effective water governance. Governing agencies in the Delta, and there's more than 200 of them with some role or another, have failed to resolve this crisis, in part because no one is really in charge. And rather than avoiding or leading us out of the crisis, some of them have actually made matters worse. They've fought over the Delta in interagency bureaucratic battles in court and in the legislature. As recently as the last few weeks, the Department of Water Resources filed briefs in federal court seeking to set aside peer-reviewed federal biological opinions for salmon and Delta smelt, just after they got the Department of Fish and Game to adopt those same biological opinions under the California Endangered Species Act. California can't afford to continue this disarray on the most important water and ecosystem issue facing our state. So today's hearing is part of a legislative attempt to forge a way forward and out of this crisis. And while some have characterized this effort as rushed, it's actually been a long road, and we're building on a very impressive body of work. In 2006, the legislature directed a process that came to be known as Delta Vision. It led to the creation by the governor of the Delta Vision Blue Ribbon Task Force and culminated just last year, late last year, with the task force's completion of a strategic plan for the Delta. And since that time, we've held multiple informational hearings in our respective houses and committees. We've convened a 60-day bicameral and bipartisan working group to address the studies and plans developed over the past few years and to lay the groundwork for comprehensive legislation to address the statewide water crisis and its focal point, the Delta. As we begin a critical public phase of that process today, I hope we all remember what's at stake here. Probably our most important decision is whether to continue with the status quo or to launch a new governance and planning structure for the Delta. A lot of people seem to be under the impression that the decision before us today is whether or not to build a peripheral canal. That is not correct. The legislation before us today takes no side on the myriad possibilities for improving Delta conveyance, whether fixes to the through Delta system or new points of diversion or new modes of conveyance. On the other hand, DWR and state and federal water contractors are already pursuing a permit process that could, and I emphasize could, result in permits for the development of a new conveyance option outside the Delta. The administration has argued it doesn't need approval from the legislature or the voters to implement that project. Now, not everyone agrees with them, but I think we can all agree that if we don't pass legislation this year, that process will continue. The real question before the legislature is whether we should establish a governance and planning framework for the Delta to reset our goals for the recovery of endangered species and the reestablishment of a healthy estuarine system instead of chaos trying to avoid extinction on a permit-by-permit, project-by-project basis, and whether we should change the way key policy decisions are made and the criteria by which they're made. Right now, Delta communities don't have any real say in how many of the key issues affecting the Delta are resolved. Right now, there's no public forum where environmental groups and other interests can bring their concerns about whether water supply operations or ecosystem restoration are meeting the requirements of state and federal law. Right now, there's no entity charged with balancing the conflicting goals in the Delta and the needs of Delta communities. So what we have to decide in the next month, starting today, is whether to continue with this current situation and cross our fingers and hope that the Delta will somehow pull out of this death spiral, or whether to chart a bold new direction. And now it's time to hear from you. This morning's conversation is about perspectives on the Delta crisis, not vague general perspectives, but panels that have been carefully put together to provide thoughtful input on the crisis and the bill package that we've put together in preprint form. My hope is that the witnesses will answer the following basic questions. First, is the status quo acceptable? I don't think anybody can seriously make that argument, but if somebody believes that, we need to hear from them today. Second, how important is it that we have a Delta solution this year? Third, what do you see as the elements of that package of Delta and water solutions? And fourth, how do you think we can improve the draft package that the legislature has developed? This won't be the last chance for input. There will be at least one more informational hearing with these committees next week, and then there will be an open and deliberative conference committee process where we will examine the bills in great detail. So with that, I want to thank my colleague and co-chair, Senator Fran Pavley, and my many colleagues here today, and I look forward to this important hearing.